as El Salvador President Bukele called a question preposterous if and when he was asked in the Oval Office about the return of the wrongfully deported Maryland father Kilmar Armando Garcia earlier on today. And there is plenty of discussion about this, as President Trump's top advisors and the president of El Salvador said Monday they had no basis for the small Central American nation to return the Maryland father who was wrongfully deported there last month. The President Trump administration officials emphasized that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was sent to a gang prison in El Salvador, was a citizen of that country, and the U.S. has no say in his future. Bukele, the president of El Salvador, who's been a vital partner for President Trump in its deportation efforts, said, quote, "Of course, I'm not going to," end quote, release him back to U.S. soil. And this as the meeting wrapping up there between President Trump and Bukele today. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox and bring into the conversation legal expert, friend of the program, Andrew Cherkasky. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. This was a bombshell meeting, some of the quotes calling it preposterous about potentially sending Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States. What do we make of what we heard and what comes next in this saga?
Well, I think that what we saw in the Oval Office today, particularly from Stephen Miller, the advisor to the president, explaining the administration's position is absolutely correct. What he's saying is that the media has effectively gotten it wrong, claiming that the Trump administration lost in the Supreme Court last week and is required to return Garcia, the Maryland man who is an MS-13 declared member, to be brought back. And so we have to go back to what the court originally said, saying that the administration would have to actually bring him back. The Supreme Court said that the district court overstepped its bounds, trying to tell the president how to execute its Article 2 duties. Those are duties that are particular to the president, guaranteed to him under Article 2 of the Constitution. One of those is foreign policy, which includes the idea of immigration of people to or from our country. And so while the Supreme Court is essentially acknowledging what the administration is acknowledging, that an error took place in the extradition of Mr. Garcia, that now the courts cannot order the president to take any certain measures other than what the law already allows for, which is basically to facilitate his return to the United States. And I can talk more about what exactly that word means, because that's been misconstrued.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question, because the facilitating of this return potentially is in question. The language in which the Supreme Court ruled, you talked about some of the lower courts ruling. What does the definition of facilitate mean? If the Supreme Court, their intention was to say that the Trump administration needed to bring him back, needed to get a plane, should they have been more clear? What do we make of that?
So what the district court had said was that the president had to effectuate the return of Garcia. That would imply to actually make it happen. The Supreme Court said that that was too far, and that they would have to facilitate his return. Now, interestingly, and in the decision, it references U.S. code or at least executive guidance that talks about about immigration laws as people kind of return. It uses the word facilitate. All facilitate effectively means is that if Mr. Garcia shows up at a point of entry, that the United States government would effectively have to allow him in. It does not mean to negotiate with a foreign government. And that's particularly impressive in this case, and important because El Salvador, the country of this man, is saying that they will not return him. And so what's America to do? Give them $1 trillion? What must the negotiation be? And that's exactly what the president gets to decide, not the courts. And so if we don't want to leverage our foreign powers to do so because it could adversely affect us, the courts can't make us, is effectively what the administration is saying.
It is so very interesting when we talk about some of these legal terms, like you mentioned there in those lower courts, but also at the Supreme Court. There also seems to be some questions about Abrego Garcia and his legal standing here in the United States. Of course, they talked about that inside the Oval Office. What do we look into when we're talking about his status in terms of the United States, in terms of the work permit that he was here? They said he was here illegally, did have those work permits. How do those mold together?
Well, I think that we have to look at this, kind of unpackage it as broadly as possible, and then start to get into the more specific questions. So, what we've been talking about is really a very basic civics lesson in terms of what the president gets to do and what the courts can and can't do with regard to interfering with the president's duties. It's like the courts trying to order military operations halted or to force the president to take certain military actions. That would be wildly against what has ever happened in our country and against the notions of the Constitution, which give the president the sole discretion. Now, as we get deeper in the weeds of kind of the different classifications, and if the Garcia case is to be fully litigated in terms of what the various rights are to have deported him, the method in which he's deported, and the appeal rights that he has to that, I think that that is something that will take time, and that the Supreme Court wasn't directly commenting on that there is a certain decision with regard to kind of all those pieces out there. Each one of these pieces potentially need to be litigated, and one of the big questions is whether that can even move forward if he's still in El Salvador. And I think the administration takes the position that until he's here, until there's lawful jurisdiction, we don't need to be going through the court systems on this.
Yeah, it's very complicated in a multitude of facets, but does it boil down to a status of a legal matter or a matter of foreign affairs? Which one is it more so?
Well, right now it's purely foreign affairs. So you've got a imagined legal case. He's not here, and so effectively he can't be arguing in our courts, and so our courts don't really have jurisdiction at all over him, and so it fully falls under that foreign policy idea. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that mistakes are made by presidents with regard to foreign policy, as well as it is in war. Look at Afghanistan and the disastrous results in what was a foreign policy decision of President Biden to leave Afghanistan. You can look at the Benghazi situation with former Secretary Clinton under the Obama administration and the terrible errors that were made that cost American lives. You can look at the lives that were lost in America due to Joe Biden's failure to stop people from coming into our country and to deport them when they were supposed to be deported, and the innocent lives that were lost due to the violence of MS-13 gang members here. So to say that there's a mistake is one thing, but to equate this mistake to the level of mistakes that are made in foreign policy that have cost so many lives in America is quite another. This is not an urgent matter, and this is not something that I think that really should even be the front page stories that it is.
And I think we're not done hearing from this story. We're not done hearing from potentially in the courts, but I believe it was the Trump administration, President Trump, that's saying he was initially wrongfully deported. Is that going to come back in any way to harm potentially this legal standing if they initially did say that they did wrongfully deport them? Does that impact this at all?
Well, I don't think that what the president says on that carries all that much weight, because as soon as he says something else that they see eye to eye with, they still go against him. So it's very much an effort to find some phraseology that they want to claim means one thing when he's saying the same thing all along. He wants to deport dangerous criminals, especially those who are part of these foreign-type terrorist or gang operations like MS-13. And so he is going to find all of the different ways to do so. The law provides a countless number of ways to deport individuals who are here under certain improper terms, and whether that's because of certain things that we're seeing, like in the Halil case at Colombia, where they're trying to deport him for those actions, or if it's Tren de Aragua members or MS-13, many different processes to do so. And so I think that there should ultimately be deference to the various lawyers figuring out the correct path. That's what happens. You have a problem and you figure out the many different ways and the most efficient ways to execute on the legal ability of the government to do that.
And you mentioned there is no urgency within the courts to figure out this because there are several legal matters at stake here. I also want to put up this post because we talked about it, as we just heard from Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, saying, if Kilmar is not home by midweek, I plan to travel to El Salvador this week to check on his condition and bring and discuss about his release. In terms of the urgency factor of this, obviously Democrats feel that it is an urgent matter. Do you think the courts will take it up sooner than later, potentially, with lawmakers like Van Hollen getting involved?
Well, lawmakers getting involved in Article 2 authority. I mean, that's what we have to go back to. Basic civics lessons. Yes, senators and congressmen can voice their concern with decisions that are made by the president on foreign policy. They can engage in some degree of fact-finding missions where they go overseas or they go to a foreign country to learn about certain information. But they absolutely cannot engage in foreign policy negotiations with foreign countries. That is solely the responsibility of the president under Article 2 and can be a violation of certain laws, in fact, if they go far enough in trying to undermine the political foreign policy interests of the president. And so this is a matter, I guess, of politics, and that public outrage could eventually motivate the Trump administration to do more negotiation to get him back. But I see this how Stephen Miller sees this, a 90-10 issue. So if 90% of the country doesn't care about this and it's a purely political question, I don't see Trump moving on this.
All right, very, very interesting. I just want to get you on the record. Do we hear the Supreme Court? Will they take this up again to clear up that language about facilitating, or do you think this matter is over for the time being?
No, I don't think that there's going to be any need to clear up the word facilitating. I think that's crystal clear. What may end up, I think, getting its way back there is if the lower court continues to press these orders that infringe on Article 2 and aren't as basic as just what the definition of that facilitation means, basically opening the door. For that purpose, I think the Supreme Court's already spoken.
All right, very good. Andrew Cherkasky, thank you so much. As President of El Salvador, Bukele gives a thumbs up, leaving the White House right there. We appreciate your time, your understanding, your perspective, and insight here on Live Now from Fox. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, we're continuing on here on Live Now from Fox. Great conversation there about that as President Trump and the administration saying they will not make an effort there only to facilitate the return of this man, this Maryland man, Kilmar Armando Garcia, from El Salvador. A post here, I want to put up the picture one more time of the El Salvador president leaving the White House after that meeting with President Trump. They were talking about some of the lower court's decision and also the Supreme Court, the 9-0 decision, saying that, of course, the latest on all of this, the legal battling surrounding this man who's deported to El Salvador, all of it playing out as Bukele in Washington, D.C. Obviously, you can see there reporters and photographers outside. Let's take you back out to this moment inside of the White House just to hear it from him in person about what Pam Bondi, what Stephen Miller had to say here on Live Now from Fox.
He was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So will you return him? And you are doing a great job. Thank you.
Stephen
Miller, wait a minute. Could you just also respond to that question? Because, you know, it's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant because they're totally slanting because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But would you answer that question also, Bruce?
Yes, gladly. So, as Pam mentioned, there's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So, it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As two immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any form of immigration relief in the United States. So he had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to ask for him to get him back?
And what was the ruling in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
in our favor.
In our favor, against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual, at El Salvador's sole discretion, was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
no version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
I asked President
Presidente
Bukele, can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm suppose you're not suggesting that I smuggle a terrorist into the United States, right?
It's always
how can I smuggle? How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, I mean, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you can release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing, I mean, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. I mean, we just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin, except for Venezuela that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President, no, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
And that's what the Supreme Court held, by the way, to Marco's point. The Supreme Court said exactly what Marco said, that no court has the authority to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. We won a case 9-0, and people like CNN are portraying it as a loss, as usual, because they want foreign terrorists in the country who kidnap women and children. But President Trump, his policy is foreign terrorists that are here illegally get expelled from the country, which, by the way, is a 90-10 issue.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You have no credibility. Please go ahead.
President Trump, thank you so much. How many illegal criminals are you planning on exporting to El Salvador? And President Bukele, how many are you willing to take from the U.S.?
As many as possible. And I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please? As many as we can get out of our country that were allowed in here by incompetent Joe Biden through open borders. Open borders. You probably hear open borders and you can't even understand it because nobody can understand. Nobody smart or with common sense can understand it. So we have millions of people that should not be in this country that are dangerous. Not just people, because we have people, but we have millions of people that are murderers, drug dealers. They've been allowed to come into our country by other countries that were very smart. When they heard that this very low IQ president, and by the way, I took my cognitive exam as part of my physical exam, and I got the highest mark, and one of the doctors said, sir, I've never seen anybody get that kind of, that was the highest mark. I hope you're happy with that. Although they haven't been bugging me too much to take a cognitive, but I did do my physical and it was released. I hope you're all happy with it. I notice there's no question, so probably you are. But the cognitive, they said to me, sir, would you like to take a cognitive test? I said, did Biden take one? No. Did anybody take one? No, not too many people took them. I said, what about Obama? Did he take one? No, he didn't take one either. I said, let me be the only one to take one. But I've actually taken them 3 times already. I like taking them because they're not too tough for me to take. But we had a great physical exam, so I know you're going to ask that. And the doctors who are total professionals, Walter Reed Medical Center, they're great people. And I visited a soldier that was badly wounded, incredible soldier, lost his leg, and spent a lot of time with him. I mean, great with his mother, and it was really a very great thing. They do a phenomenal job. I just want to say, Walter Reed, I was there for, 5-6 hours. You were there with me. But
all right, just listening in to President Trump as he's now discussing that most recent health report, talking about that. But the major headline with that meeting with the El Salvador President Bukele, talking about how they will not be returning the man deported to that country. Of course, a post from Fox News saying from Bukele, yeah, we're not really fond of releasing terrorists into our country. The Supreme Court ruling that they could facilitate them, but Bukele said it was preposterous that they would return him to the United States. I'm Andy Mack here on Live Now from Fox. We're back after this.